The American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, encouraged slave owners to voluntarily emancipate their bondsmen and resettle them in Africa. Although this was an attempt to deal with the problem of slavery, it also reflected the deep racism still prevalent. Very simply, many of these reformers, who were concerned about the institution of slavery and the effect it had upon American society, could not imagine actually living with free African Americans. The colonization effort reached its peak in the 1820s, when nationally eminent slaveholders such as Henry Clay, James Monroe, and John Marshall endorsed this plan. In 1822, the first permanent settlement of free blacks from the United States was established in Liberia, in West Africa. Ultimately, however, this experiment failed. Few slave owners were tempted to liberate their slaves, and few free African Americans really wished to abandon the country that had become their home. The real spark that ignited the abolitionist crusade was the Second Great Awakening. Many Northerners, disturbed by the materialism and corruption of the changing society around them, placed much of the blame on the slave system. They, of course, were not slaveholders. They were not directly guilty of this sin, but the Great Awakening, with its message of free will, of human agency, made it impossible for them to escape the guilt of not doing something about this evil, and it imbued them with an urgency to do something to make their society better. Thus, in the early 1830s, many of the former members of the Colonization Society rejected its message of weak gradualism and began to enunciate a demand for immediate, uncompensated, unconditional emancipation. In 1832, they helped form the New England Anti-Slavery Society, whose membership included both women and African Americans. This society pledged itself not only to immediate emancipation, but also to forswear all racial prejudice, to, quote, secure to the colored population all the rights and privileges that belong to them as men and as Americans. The paths of preferment, of wealth, and of intelligence should be opened as widely to them as to persons of white complexion, unquote. By 1833, a national movement had emerged, the American Anti-Slavery Society. They sought to cause change in a number of ways. Reformers like William Lloyd Garrison attempted to use moral persuasion and reason to influence opinion in both the North and the South, often in very radical and uncompromising terms. In the first issue of his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, Garrison stated emphatically, quote, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject I do not wish to think, or speak, or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Unquote. In 1835, the abolitionist societies began a great postal campaign to flood every city, every town, and every village in the country with anti-slavery pamphlets, targeting in particular ministers, elected officials, and newspaper editors, in other words, people who shaped opinion. By the end of 1837, over 1 million pieces of literature had been distributed. 1835 also saw the beginning of another campaign aimed at inundating Congress with anti-slavery petitions. Local organizers, who were very often women, carried petitions door to door in search of signatures, and in many northern communities they were successful, particularly among women, who would ultimately provide over half the signatures on these documents. In part, the success stemmed from the relatively modest content of these proposals. Many who would have hesitated to sign petitions calling for immediate, uncompensated emancipation were nonetheless willing to endorse more limited goals, such as the abolishment of slavery in the District of Columbia and the barring of further slave states from entry into the Union. In 1837, this campaign intensified, and by May of 1838, 415,000 petitions had been forwarded to Congress. Free African Americans played a key role in these efforts, as petitioners, as subscribers to and authors of anti-slavery literature, and as speakers, including such notables as Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, who were able to provide eloquent testimony for the cause of abolition from their first-hand experiences. What was the result of all these efforts? In the South, the abolitionist cause made no headway at all. Southerners, including Andrew Jackson, urged the federal government to make it illegal to send anti-slavery literature through the mail, and they succeeded in pressuring Congress in 1836 to institute a gag rule, under which all anti-slavery petitions were automatically barred from debate. They could not be presented to Congress. They could not be discussed. Nor did the abolitionists initially receive much of a welcome in the North. As Alexis de Tocqueville observed in the early 1830s, quote, "Race prejudice seems stronger in those states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists, and nowhere is it more intolerant than in those states where it has never been known." Unquote. Indeed, African Americans in the North, while not slaves, were hardly free. Most of the northern states denied blacks the right to vote. They were barred from most professions and trades, excluded from public schools or sent to segregated schools, given segregated seats in the churches and in public transportation. They could not hold office or serve on a jury, and they were prohibited from settling in several of the western states. Thus, it was not surprising that even in the North, abolitionist speakers were often harassed by angry mobs. Their meetings were disrupted, their presses burned, and speakers were attacked. Northern politicians, having no wish to disrupt the status quo, were also generally opposed to the actions of the abolitionists. However, the abolitionists undoubtedly did have an impact upon Northern thinking. They brought the issue of slavery to the fore, and they kept it there. No citizen could pick up a newspaper without hearing about riots, gag rules, abolitionist meetings, and Southern fury. Gradually, there came to be an alarm in the North at what was happening. Many began to ask, are there no civil liberties anymore? Has the right to peacefully assemble, the right to free speech, the right to petition Congress been withdrawn? They asked as well, who is behind this? Who is conspiring to destroy our civil liberties? For many, the answer was obvious. It was the South, the slave power, reaching up into northern communities and creating this turmoil. There were also some sympathizers in high places. John Quincy Adams, the former president and now a member of Congress, repeatedly offered anti-slavery petitions in defiance of the gag rule and argued eloquently for the right of free debate. Slowly, a small group of Whig politicians began following his example. By the late 1830s, the anti-slavery movement was increasingly splintered over how to deal with the mob violence and how to further their goals. Some, such as Garrison, urged a continuation of the policy of education and moral persuasion, arguing that African Americans would never truly be free as long as the country remained racist. Others, seeing the limitations of moral persuasion, began to argue for more direct and coercive action. The Underground Railroad, for instance, was an informal network of abolitionists who aided fleeing slaves and conducted them to safety. In part, this aid was proffered by sympathetic whites, and in part by other African Americans. Harriet Tubman, for instance, escaped slavery in Maryland, and then returned 19 times to aid several hundred other blacks to flee. More importantly, the abolitionist movement began to look to the federal government to force an end to slavery. These efforts began with the creation of third-party movements, such as the Liberty Party founded in 1840 and the Free Soil Party founded in 1848. By the 1850s, the anti-slavery sentiment had begun to work its way into the mainstream parties. In large part, the political appeal of the anti-slavery movement lay less in northern concerns for the rights of African Americans and more with concerns about the rights of white Northerners. Northern politicians emphasized what they saw as a conspiracy of the slave power, the South, to destroy the civil liberties and free economic system of Northern white men. They became particularly alarmed as slavery threatened to move into the Western territories, a region which many white Northerners felt should be reserved solely for free labor. Still, the moral message of abolitionism did have an impact upon the North. When Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in the early 1850s, it became a huge success, becoming the second best-selling book of the entire 19th century. Her heart-rending story of an African-American mother trying to save her children from slavery struck a chord with Northern audiences and fueled a growing sense among these audiences that slavery was not just a threat to their liberties, but also a fundamental moral evil. While unsuccessful in persuading Southerners to abandon slavery, the abolitionist movement had helped make this an unavoidable national issue, leading ultimately to the Civil War and the end of slavery.